Hello, I am Brian Kemple, and for those of you who do not know me, allow me briefly to introduce myself. I received my doctorate in philosophy in 2016 with the Center for Thomistic Studies at the University of St. Thomas in Houston, Texas, where I wrote my doctoral dissertation under John Deely. That dissertation became my first scholarly monograph titled Ens Primum Cognitum in Thomas Aquinas and the Tradition, which was published in 2017. A second monograph, The Intersection of Semiotics and Phenomenology, Peirce and Heidegger in Dialogue, was published in 2019. Since then, I have left traditional academia to found the Lyceum Institute, an online environment for lifelong development of the philosophical habit, where I currently serve as executive director. This lecture was first given at St. Vincent College in Latrobe, Pennsylvania, where John Deely ended his career. It has since been revised and expanded, and I hope it will serve as a suitable introduction to the often abstruse-seeming study of semiotics. So allow me to begin with a prefatory comment. It is difficult to give a presentation on semiotics for two reasons. The first, and perhaps more obvious reason, is that few people know what it really is. It's an unusual word. It's a word that might sound exciting, somehow, but also kind of mysterious. The second reason it's difficult, very much related to the first, is that semiotics is at once a relatively new doctrine, and yet it's one which subsumes and incorporates and even elevates certain disciplines which are very ancient. Its explicit recognition throughout history has been rare, but its implicit influence is ubiquitous in time and in place. Moreover, semiotics brings us face to face with something which is unknown and yet nevertheless deeply familiar. And perhaps in some regard it is even unknown because it is so familiar, namely, the sign. And so, although the temptation in a presentation such as this presentation being intended as an introduction to semiotics, the temptation is to pass a considerable amount of time traversing the meandering inquiry of what semiotics is, wending through the particularities of its doctrines, its terminologies, its histories. But despite this temptation, I will spend relatively little time retreading those already well-worn steps. There are many books, papers, and presentations which already exist that cover the doctrinal, terminological, and historical grounds of semiotics. But despite these many introductions, I think semiotics remains somewhat mysterious to many. And so I wish today to head in a different direction. And I hope that you will all walk this perhaps even more meandering path alongside me, for I believe despite its many wandering steps, it will give a kind of circumspective view of that well-tread ground, and thereby dispel some of the inhibiting enigma. So who among you, I'm both curious and a little afraid to ask, who among you feels confident today about the near future? About your individual future, the future of your personal sphere, about the future of your culture, your country, or of the whole world? I ask this as a rhetorical question, of course. No doubt the answers you would give would vary from each and every one of you, and perhaps those answers vary even within your own minds or from day to day. That is, I think we all have at least a few reasons in the here and now to feel some hope for ourselves and for the world, but also many reasons to feel fear or perhaps even some despair. Reasons to believe on the one hand that things may improve, or other reasons to believe that they may get far, far worse, in or after our lifetimes, whether in the next year or in the next century. Now, both this fear and this hope seem accelerated, exacerbated perhaps even, by the speed at which human experience of the world seems today to change, a speed really unlike in any era previous. The swiftness of news, the shortness of its cycle, the instantaneous draw, pull, the connection to events and persons across the globe, the endless distraction from distraction by distraction. The digital age in which we are immersed by seemingly every screen at nearly every waking hour of the day allows us no sense of rest, of contemplation, of residing in any continual presence of what we might consider true or meaningful. We seem no sooner to think that we might be beginning to understand what is happening in the world, that we might have gained some sense of what is true, then everything shifts, is tossed, and we are entangled by other threads of different, competing, and always incomplete, unsatisfactory narratives. I suspect that this perpetual psychological unrest really has led many to despair of truth as a good to be obtained and therefore even worth being sought. And thus instead, the very concept of truth becomes profoundly, fundamentally relativized. We hear people talking about my truth, your truth, our truth, but less and less does there seem to be belief in and seeking of the truth. Well, who among you can live like this? Not a one of you. Nor, for that matter, can anyone else, even those who aren't listening to this lecture. That is, I do not think that this swirling, chaotic, disinformational, post-truth world is a situation to which human beings can adapt. I mean, we are adaptable creatures, granted, more so probably than at least any other mammal. We find ways to endure, to survive, to thrive even, despite the most unfavorable of material conditions. But this enduring, this surviving and thriving, this does not come as an inevitable consequence of being in any environment whatsoever. It comes rather as a matter of those environments becoming structured by certain principles. We have a fundamental human need. In order that we can endure, survive, and thrive, we have a need for coherence, for things to fit together somehow. And that coherence itself needs some principle by which it is organized, by which it is brought together, some cause which holds the elements and objects of our experience together somehow into something united, something whole. Our current absence of a coherent world, indeed I would say our presence instead of an increasingly incoherent world, wherein fewer and fewer persons seem capable of having meaningful conversations with one another, this beseeks the absence of just such a principle. And so I am here to argue, to all of you listening to this lecture, that semiotics, and I believe semiotics alone, is the study which can provide that principle which we so sorely need. For inasmuch as we use anything that we do not understand, however successfully we might regard that use, we nevertheless thereby expose ourselves both to errors of our own making and to being manipulated by others, most especially if we are complacent about the role that these means play in our lives. I, for one, think this is actually quite obvious, and its obviousness may be seen by a moment's reflection on how people become drug addicts, or addicted to pornography, or persuaded to purchase something which is not only unneeded, but not even initially wanted, persuaded by any marketing or advertising campaign to make such a purchase. But despite the obviousness of this truth, we all continue quite carelessly to make use of very many things which we do not understand, and nothing more commonly and dangerously than that ubiquitous subject matter of semiotics, signs. For indeed, signs are omnipresent in our experience. They permeate every academic discipline or field, every class presentation or assignment, every lecture or question-answer session. You, wherever you are immersed in a world of signs at this very moment, and have been every day, every hour, every minute, every second of your entire life. You cannot read a press release, hear a news report, cannot view statistics, nor pick up a journal from a library, a book of philosophy or literature or history, even a romance novel or a piece of idle fiction, without thereby moving deeper into a sign-perfused reality. You cannot drive down the road, whether it is an interstate highway or a backcountry gravel path, without using countless signs to do so. You cannot even have a conversation, or look at another person's face, or have a single banal, mundane, idle thought about the cute girl who sits next to you in class, or whom you see on the bus, or what's to watch on Netflix or Hulu or YouTube or Disney Plus, let alone open or use social media without making use of countless signs. And all this barely scratches the surface of our specifically human semiosis, that is, the use of signs which we make inasmuch as we are human. Now, most especially, if we are to take or understand anything experienced in our lives as having meaning, that is, as having some reality such that we can say what it is, even vaguely or obliquely, and relate that to the conduct of our lives, we can do so only because it has been signified to us somehow. The causality whereby such signification occurs is itself always a complex web, and a collective cultural widespread ignorance of that web has allowed chaos and confusion, disinformation, and a pervasive relativization of the truth, spurred on by a rapid advance of communication technologies and the instantaneity of information access, to spiral out of control, both in our own lives as individuals and as a culture, and perhaps even in a fragmentary way as a civilization. And so, in this lecture, drawing upon a few powerful insights of the late semiotician and my friend John Deely, who lived from 1942 until 2017, who taught for many years first at Loras College in Dubuque, Iowa, then many more at the University of St. Thomas in Houston, Texas, and who finally relocated not long before his passing to St. Vincent College in Latrobe, Pennsylvania, where there is a reading room in the library named in his honor, and where he donated his personal library of over 14,000 volumes, and with whom, as aforementioned, I wrote my doctoral dissertation. Drawing upon Deely's thought, I will sketch an outline of how semiotics, as the study whereby we learn how to interpret signs, can have an impact on everything else that we do, with the expectation that further connections may be elaborated in further discussions concerning semiotics, both in live sessions and in written communiques, and with the hope that you will see, regardless of your background, your field or focus of study, or your career, that semiotics stands as a necessity to the true flourishing of your intellectual life. Before taking up the explicit impact of semiotics, however, I must first remark that it was one of Deely's most frequent and best articulated claims, and in a way the one that led me to study with him, that human beings are distinguished among all the other animals in our cognitive capabilities by a unique relation to signs, and specifically regarding the awareness of signs. That is, Where all animals commonly make use of signs, only human beings are aware of the fact that they make use of signs. Or to put this another way, all animals exist within some environment. By the word environment, I mean not only the surrounding physical things, such as the deer that may exist among trees and streams, foliage, and other animals, but rather I mean the pattern of relations between those things and the animals cognizant of them. Animals, in other words, do not live among things as things, but rather among things as objects which are relative to themselves. The deer does not see a tree but that which shelters, not a stream but that which quenches thirst, not foliage but something to eat, and not a wolf but a threat. Similarly, your dog hears your car coming up the driveway and knows that you are returning home, but the dog does not know what a driveway is, nor a car, nor even what you are. You are to the dog that which feeds and loves and cares, and that for which your dog cares and loves as well, though it does not name these reactions to you. She may pine for your return, and long for your pets, but she does not contemplate what it means for you to be human, or what it means to be male or female, or what the sun is, or what it might signify. The meaning of any sign for any non-human earthly creature is entirely circumscribed by its referentiality to the animal. That is, its meaning for the animal depends ultimately upon a series of estimations concerning whether the object is beneficial, harmful, or neutral with respect to the animal itself. In other words, meaning for non-human animals is not only self-centric, but wholly self-oriented. By contrast, meaning for the human being, while it incorporates such referentiality, meaning for the human being depends instead on what things are in themselves, independently of, and we might even say superior to, our evaluation of them as beneficial, harmful, or neutral with respect to ourselves. We do contemplate what it means to be human, or to be male or female, or what the sun is, and what it tells us about the structure of the solar system, the galaxy, the cosmos at large, and even about ourselves. The specifically human environment has an expansiveness incomparably larger than that possessed by any other animal, constituted not only by physically related objects, but the culture, comprising not only the things of immediate actionable importance, but also those of theoretical curiosity, even those objects which have no bearing on the here and now purposes of practical need or want. Now, this irreducibility of our objects to our own evaluations of them is what makes the attainment of coherence, the production of a coherent world, so much more difficult for us human beings. Your dog does not have to worry about injustice or laws, or whether she ought to focus on career or having puppies. In fact, she cannot have such worries. Rather, she worries about dinner, and getting treats, and going outside, and enjoying pets. Matters are not so simple for us. Whether we are right about our actions, that is, seems not merely a matter of our own making or own satisfaction, but rather always to depend upon something larger and independent of us as individuals. Consider theories of what it is, or of what it means to be a human being. We have such theories given to us from the pre-Socratics stemming as early as the 7th century BC, through Plato and Aristotle in the 4th century BC, from east, from west, from Catholicism, and especially the Catholic philosophy produced by Augustine in the late 4th and early 5th centuries AD, from the Latin scholasticism roughly spanning the 9th through the 17th centuries, from Renaissance humanism, Enlightenment rationalism, and our current hyper-modern quasi-existentialist subjectivism. Thus, faced with a question about the meaning and rectitude of human life and its conduct, we might ourselves come up with answers which are correct, incorrect, or partly right and partly wrong. Or we might listen to competing answers given by others, similarly deviant from correctness, mingled and mangled into a hodgepodge simulacrum of a true answer, and we would thereby be but one mind among those spanning millennia who have asked and attempted to answer such a question. We could therefore search among these many theories for our entire lives and find no consensus, no seemingly airtight theory that immediately turns down all objections with solid and irrefutable answers. We might then, dismayed by one such disappointing seeming simulacrum after another, come to believe that there is no truth about anything, no meaning, no intelligibility, no correct or incorrect ways of understanding what it is to be human, and therefore no definitive answer for how we ought to live. Or we might arrive at the belief that we're incapable of attaining any truth at all. But even such beliefs as these, increasingly common nihilistic attitudes towards life, these too are at least implicitly claims or beliefs about things themselves. Now, this orientation of our cognitive lives toward things as they are in themselves, not exclusively, but undeniably so ordered, this is what we mean by saying that humans know being. To know being is to see beyond the limitations of mere animal estimation. It is what enables us to say whether something is good or bad, and not merely whether we like it or not, but to make a claim about the thing itself. Of course, this knowledge whereby good is discerned from bad does not come immediately or all at once, nor does it come easily, most especially because we are also quite concerned with not just whether it is good or bad, but whether or not we like it. And often we will go through impressive mental gymnastics to justify ourselves liking something, which is in fact something bad. Indeed, we'll convince ourselves that it is not bad. Maybe in fact that it is really something good. Or conversely, we'll convince ourselves that something which is good is in fact bad, or at least that it's not good for us, at least not right now. Who hasn't excused a bad behavior or demurred from a good one for a reason that we had to work hard to create or find or justify? Maybe we didn't have to work all that hard. But I think if you're honest, you'll say that you've done that many a time. And if you are dishonest, you are practicing that very self-excusatory behavior at just this very moment. So, how, we must ask ourselves, do we guide our efforts of interpretation? How do we navigate these complex paths of liking and disliking, of discovering and distinguishing the good from the bad? My answer, succinctly stated, is that the good and our ability to obtain it always depends upon the truth about the good. And here it is that semiotics enters as the discipline and study which can become just such a guide. For now, despite my efforts to avoid the question, and however briefly I wish to answer it, we must nevertheless ask, what is semiotics? Well, it has been defined and described in many ways, both in its implicit and explicit historical formulations. I like myself to describe, but not define, semiotics as the unveiling of the familiar unknown, for it studies signs and the action of signs, and it unveils the nature and functioning of signs, and signs are as ingrained in our existence as breathing. though I dare say that most people have likely thought more about their breathing than they have about signs, at least signs explicitly insofar as they are signs. Nothing is more familiar to us in experience than the sign, and yet despite that it remains something remarkably unknown to us. If I were to ask most people, I believe, to define a sign, they would probably struggle to do so. And so Dealey defined semiotics in what is likely the simplest, most succinct, and most accurate definition as the study of the action of signs. That is, how it is that signs do what they do. But there is another definition of semiotics, offered by its most important founder, Charles Sanders Peirce, who lived from 1839 to 1914. Namely, that semiotics is the normative science of truth. Now, this definition demands of us that we ask two further questions, namely, what is meant by normative and what is meant by science. As to the latter, science, it was the eventual position of Peirce himself that the most fundamental meaning of this ubiquitous term today was neither the common definition possibly familiar to many of you, that is, the definition of science as an organized body of knowledge, nor was it well defined as merely the methodology of hypothesis and experimentation, but rather it is properly understood as a continuing, communal, collective inquiry whereby we seek better understanding of what is. A concept, a definition of science, or an understanding of science, which does not reject either the organized body of knowledge nor that of hypothesis and experimentation, but I would say includes and elevates them into something larger and into something which is more properly human. For a science to be normative, on the other hand, means that it directs this continuing communal inquiry towards the general rules or laws which govern the object that it studies. Thus, semiotics, as the normative science of truth, is that science whereby we understand the constitution of truth itself, what it is always, and the manners in which it may be revealed, following upon what it is and how it can come into being in any matter where truth can be said to be present at all. Now, broadly speaking, or at least broadly speaking enough for our own purposes here today, Peirce distinguished sciences into what would be called ideoscopic and cenoscopic manners of inquiry. The ideoscopic are those studies that today we normally call science, studies such as biology, chemistry, physics, medicine, geology, and so on. The cenoscopic comprises what we might call the humanities, although it should be noted that our contemporary divisions do not align precisely with those that Peirce himself proposed, and that further there is a kind of historical muddling of the humanities and the liberal arts. Regardless, Peirce placed semiotics among the cenoscopic sciences. But this does not mean that semiotics has nothing to say about the practice of ideoscopic sciences or their orientation toward the truth. Far from it. For what distinguishes the ideoscopic from the cenoscopic is that the former relies upon specialized training and the use of specific instruments or methodologies for conducting its research, while cenoscopic inquiry concerns the use of that most general instrument which is accessible by all human beings, namely our natural capacity for intellectual reasoning, that specifically human attunement to studying what things are, in other words, that studying which conceives the being of things. Now, whatever discoveries we make within the ideoscopic, which is indeed concerned, or ought to be concerned, principally with the discovery of new phenomena, of unveiling things which we cannot detect by our natural capacities unaided through instrumentation or methodology. Whatever discoveries we make ideoscopically must be resoluble to a general intelligibility as true, and thus such discoveries rely always upon that normativity provided by semiotics. For all of our studies are carried out by the use of signs. As aforementioned, you cannot do anything without making use of them. But to understand that which we are studying, do we not need to understand the means by which that study is carried out? Can we understand what our numbers, our statistics, our tables and our figures, our diagrams and our words and arguments signify if we do not have some understanding of signification itself? Therefore, let's take up this fundamental question, namely, what is a sign? This is a question of paramount universal importance. There are many answers which have been offered, such as that the sign is that which affects a relation of renvoi, or that the sign is that which every object presupposes, that the sign is that which stands for something other than itself. All of these are true answers, though by themselves they do not sufficiently inform us as to the nature of the sign. We need a deeper understanding, lest we make the common mistake of taking the sign to be an individual thing, like the stop sign at the street corner, or the plastic signs informing someone where to exit a building, or the seal of the Lyceum Institute, or the logo for Facebook. All these things, to be sure, play a role in signification, but they do not exhaust what a sign is, nor, for that matter, do they fundamentally constitute the sign. Something more is required. Consider a woman from a remote, isolated village on North Sentinel Island, where exists one of the few remaining closed societies in the world. Such a woman would have no concept of the law which is signified by the stop sign so common in the Western world. Seeing a stop sign, would it still signify to her the same way that it does to you? Similarly, someone unlearned in the English language may not know the word exit. And a great many people, seeing the seal of the Lyceum Institute, may recognize it as vaguely heraldic, but would they know that it signifies this institute? Younger individuals might see the logo for Facebook and think, the social media for old people. Whereas those on the older side of things might see it and still think, it's that hip thing all the kids use. Put otherwise, these things which we ordinarily call signs are in fact what have been better termed as sign vehicles. They convey, they carry signification, but they do not constitute it. For in order that signification occurs in fact, one thing must signify something other than itself to a yet further something other than itself. In other words, there need to be three terms involved in order that an act of signification occurs. First, there must be a signifier, that sign vehicle, or that which does the signifying, which Peirce sometimes called by the technical term representamen. Second, there must be a significate, an object which is signified, the something for which the sign vehicle stands. And third, there must be what Peirce termed the interpretant, that to which or to whom the signification is made. This is a term which Peirce invented to cover a very broad range of possible beings, but which in our experience is most obvious and most typically exhibited in living beings, especially animals, and most especially in ourselves. Now, one and the same representamen or sign vehicle, seen by two different interpretants, may signify objects which are different from each other, at least in part. So you and your grandmother, for instance, might both see the Facebook logo, and both of you may have the object of social media generically in mind, but that objectivized social media is not conceived in the same way by each of you. Just as you might see the seal of the Lyceum Institute and think of a digital environment for learning in the perennial philosophical tradition of the Western world, while someone from the remote village of Kalanak in Tajikistan who's never heard of it would think of something else entirely. Now, the actuality of signification, therefore, always consists in some relation, and therefore, indeed, the sign itself is constituted as an irreducibly triadic relation, one of three terms, between an object and an interpretant accomplished through the mediation of a sign vehicle. This is a complex definition, so I will repeat it. The sign is an irreducibly triadic relation between an object and an interpretant accomplished through the mediation of a sign vehicle. Absent this triadic structure, absent, that is, any one or more of the three elements, signification cannot occur, and nothing would be a sign in actuality. Now further, absent an awareness of this triadic relation, we may frequently misunderstand the signs through which our world is constituted, perhaps most especially within academic studies, within the university, and within the various diverse fields in which people receive education, both as these fields are related to one another as well as within themselves. And so I wish here to unveil briefly and passingly and perhaps somewhat contentiously some of the apparent faults currently undermining a few popular, or at least well-known, fields of study. First, psychology. Second, biology. Third, philosophy. And fourth, communication and journalism. As a caveat, I'm not here attempting to demonstrate convincingly anything concerning how these disciplines ought to be practiced, but only to show some of what appear to be deep and dangerous chasms in the landscape of meaning, and perhaps to suggest that semiotics can help us to avoid these chasms, to fill them in, and produce a more continuous intellectual environment. So first, psychology. In 2015, a report was somewhat infamously published by the Open Science Collaboration, in which it was shown that among 100 studies published in high-ranking psychology journals, which is the literature that drives the field, only a relatively small percentage of these could be replicated with strong results. Or to put this in simple words, a lot of studies, which were published and promoted as though they demonstrated strong evidence in support of some hypothesis, were, in fact, undermined by profound flaws in their research conduct and possibly the methodologies of the psychological field as a whole. These flaws were exposed by the fact that other researchers, following the experiments as they were presented by the original researchers, could not replicate the results or even produce results sufficiently comparable to those in the original studies to give confidence in their veracity. Now, this replication crisis, as it has been called, extends to include studies in medicine, economics, marketing, and other disciplines as well, but it has been most profoundly exhibited in psychology. As can be imagined, this crisis has undermined confidence in these disciplines, and especially in psychology, which has often been touted, and was touted at least in the 20th century, as a kind of improved, modern, and scientific substitute or displacement for religion. Well, why this profound and systematic problem? On the one hand, the replication crisis unveiled explicitly faulty and often ethically questionable, if not downright immoral practices in the conduct of much research. Manipulation, for instance, of data to exclude problematic results or ones which seemed to disprove or suggest against the hypothesis. Or manipulation of data to find coincidental correspondences which could nevertheless be proposed as correlational and therefore significant. As well as post hoc reinterpretations of data, fudging one's hypothesis, in other words, to fit the results. And it further exposed also the pervasive problem of publication bias. In other words, journals prefer to publish sexy positive results rather than the dull negative ones. And so researchers are inclined by that tendency to seek and publish as though they have discovered something positive, even if the negative is more important for the advance of science in its proper methodology. Now, these problems plaguing the discipline have led to unresolved confusions and deep rifts among its practitioners. One such example of these rifts can be found in a concept frequently touted within social psychology over the past 20-plus years, namely the concept which is known as ego depletion. Summarily stated, ego depletion holds that willpower or volition is a limited mental resource which becomes exhausted over time when used, much like energy in your muscles, and needs to be replenished before one is able to have control over oneself again. In other words, that you can only hold out against a temptation or a desire for so long. And if you are tired, or inebriated, or otherwise impaired, you will have less ability to maintain your will in holding out against a temptation. In some ways, this phenomenon names something obviously true. That is, it is obviously true that our self-control varies, and that it becomes more difficult to maintain when we are impaired or inebriated or tired. But the central core of the hypothesis, that this ability for self-control is a limited resource, has become quite controversial. Now, the original study which named this phenomenon was published in 1998 and has since been cited over 7,000 times, according to the metrics provided by Google Scholar. In academia, that is an enormous number of times for any study to be cited. Countless other studies have been performed on the presumption of this original one's basic premise. Indeed, the lead author of the original study eventually penned a New York Times bestseller popularizing the concept for the self-help market, and countless other peddlers of self-help psychology have latched onto the idea as well. There's even a Willpower for Dummies book out there. Since the replication crisis, however, other analyses have challenged the validity of ego depletion experiments, while others still have attempted to verify them, with both sides primarily focusing on the methodology. For instance, unaccounted for variables in both test and control groups, such as background, socioeconomic conditions, intelligence, time of day, time since last meal, etc., etc. Or things like the tracking of the participants in subsequent years. And so the debate continues as to whether or not this phenomenon is real or it has been accurately measured or described in the studies propounding it. So long as the focus remains on the methodology, however, I think that neither this problem nor many of the others within psychology will in fact be resolved. The deepest, the most fundamental problem is not whether the methodology is sound. Don't get me wrong, such is of course a problem of pressing and central concern within the discipline of psychology itself, and one to which semiotics might in fact be of great aid, inasmuch as it may help to clarify the nature and functioning of the signs which are produced by the experiments within psychology. But the deeper problem here concerns the meaning of what it is that is even being studied. In our example case here, willpower is a supposed phenomenon named only from its effect and not investigated in any way as to what it supposedly is itself. The name, in other words, the name willpower, lacks a proper referent. Now, this lack of referent, this lack of a something real, is a problem endemic throughout psychology. Today, it affects even the fundamental object which psychology exists to study, the psyche. To what does that refer in psychology? You're not going to get much of an answer from most people practicing within psychology. The intended object of study, in other words, has become so isolated from the contexts of intelligible being that the results of any of its studies become almost, if not entirely, unintelligible to anyone outside the discipline. And even then, those within the discipline are, I suspect, often talking right past one another. That is, their words, their sign vehicles may appear to be the same, but I'm not convinced in the absence, in the paucity of real reference for their terminologies, that they're always speaking about the same objects, or that they're even speaking about intelligible objects at all. So to turn our attention now to the second topic, let's think briefly about controversies within the science of biology, and specifically those controversies concerning the beginning and the end of life. Now, I'm not here attending to the moral issues involved, to which semiotics can be of great help as well in the burgeoning area of semioethics. But rather here I'm focusing upon the scientific questions which must necessarily precede any inquiry into the moral, for right practical thinking comes by a certain extension from correct speculative insight. That is to say, I want to think here about the question of what it means for something to be alive. Now, it might seem that this is a strictly biological question, perhaps even the biological question, and so it has often been framed in recent centuries. But I think it seems also a question that biology may not in fact be equipped to answer, at least not all on its own. That is, can we discern a line of clear and precise demarcation, on one side of which something is said to be alive, and on the other side not? What is it that makes a living organism to be living? The supposedly standard answer given in contemporary biology is not in fact entirely standard. That is, the answer of biologists consists generally in a list of characteristics which must be possessed. But these lists vary. Some include 5 characteristics, others 7, others yet as many as 10 or 12. It has been argued that some of the shorter lists contain implicitly what is stated explicitly in those that are longer, or that the longer lists are somehow sometimes redundant, repeating things, saying one and the same thing in two slightly different ways. Nevertheless, the precise nature of the characteristics does not have absolute agreement among practitioners of the science. There is not yet, and may in fact never be, if things continue on as they have, a universal consensus within biology on what it means to be alive. But even if such a consensus does come about, even if there could be a final agreement on a list of such characteristics, does that consensus in fact produce a grasp of meaning? Commonly, the characteristics enumerated within these lists include growth and development, the use of energy, the ability to reproduce, and a constitution from cellular structures, as well as some degree of responsiveness and adaptiveness to the environment. But what does it mean to focus on these last two, to be responsive or adaptive? If something is responsive to its environment, but in a highly dependent way upon the nature of the stimulus, where the use of energy by the organism is directly dependent upon something provided from that environment, does it still count as living? Does the virus, for instance, count as living based upon the above criteria, given the extent to which its apparently vital activity is entirely dependent upon the cell of some other living organism? Well, no, for the virus is not made of cells. But how then are we to explain the lifelike activities of the virus? Semiotics does immediately provide some understanding of viral activity, I believe, namely that the virus, inasmuch as it does not engage actively in what we call endosemiosis while it is outside the cell of some living organism, endosemiosis signifying an internal process of sign use, despite the absence of such independent endosemiosic activity, the virus does have a potency for what we call exosemiosis, that is, a process of sign use relative to something outside of itself, by which exosemiosis it in fact infects the cell, and through that exosemiosis alters the cell's own endosemiosic functioning. Now, I'm not here bringing up this complex example and these complex terms in order to dive into the weeds of biosemiotics. Rather, I'm mentioning it only to say that with semiotics, we may provide an intelligible account of how and why the virus seems to exist on the threshold of life, without maybe necessarily fitting entirely into that term. That is, if we understand life in semiotic terms, insofar as life consists in a certain utilization of signs in accordance with the internal structure of the being as it relates to its environment, which I think reveals to us in some regard that life is not distinguished by a threshold, not distinguished by a line of demarcation, but exists along a gradient. A being, such as a virus which exhibits exosemiosis, even if it lacks endosemiosis, seems intelligibly closer to life than a being which exhibits neither. Or we might consider the oft-debated, and perhaps more controversial than you know, topic of so-called brain death. That is, although neurological criteria have been used to determine the death of human beings since the 1950s, challenges have been raised very consistently against these criteria since at least the late 1980s, given that numerous studies have shown bodies of so-called brain-dead individuals to sometimes go on living and even developing despite the lack of extrinsic medical intervention. In other words, the criteria of brain death is linked to the integrative functioning of the whole body, its normal responsiveness and adaptation to environment, in other words, but there is evidence that this may not be the whole story. In other words, there is no doubt that the body of a brain-dead person continues living, if we understand living or the life of any organism to consist in a certain pattern of semiosis, rather than the functioning of a single part of the organism alone. Third, I wish to say a brief word about my own discipline, namely philosophy. For today, it suffers no less an incoherence internally than do any of the other sciences. No small part of this incoherence stems from the fact that philosophy is accepted as though it is just one among the other sciences or studies. This reduction of its scope to being a one among the many instead of somehow a one which is related to and related through and exhibited and practiced and utilized and integral among all the others, and the subsequent marginalized place in the intellectual life of our culture. This reduction and marginalization explains more than any other single element the fragmentation of our studies and the fragmentation of our understanding. Now, I will avoid the thorny, lengthy, and complex history of this diminution of the philosophical, and say instead that its current effete standing ought to be taken as an opportunity to question again its own roots, to ask, that is, what is philosophy? Is it a mere dilettantish amusement, the occupation of intellectual aesthetes, for making oneself entertaining at cocktail parties or at the bar? Or is it a science? Or is it a field of studies? Or is it something else? Antiquity, to be certain, viewed philosophy neither as a mere amusement nor as a one among many of the courses which one could take or degrees which one could earn in an academy. Rather, it was a way of living, a way of ordering one's thinking, a way of questioning one's own understanding. It is a habit of seeking understanding, not merely of this or that particular object of study, but of all things together, of all things as they form a certain whole. By contrast, today, one attempting to discover the nature of philosophy, whether doing so in the university or on the internet, will be bombarded with distinctions of schools, approaches, traditions, central figures or thinkers, and, increasingly, nuanced debates, entry into which removes one ever farther from the common life of human beings. This removal from natural life afflicts particularly the mainstream of so-called analytic philosophy, which has become the dominant force in the Western university, and which I would argue has done more than anything else to contribute to the diminishment of philosophy in the university, and by extension the diminishment of the university itself, but now I'm digressing into that history which I'm trying to avoid. Thus it is that philosophical study, insofar as it becomes self-contained and insular, thereby loses its proper character. And indeed, by the loss of the proper character of philosophy, so too do all the other sciences lose something of their own proper characters as well. For philosophy, as a way of life and ordering one's own thinking, has also been a way of ordering all thinking about any topic or any subject whatsoever. And so, absent the unity which is affected by philosophical wisdom, the sciences spiral outward in their own distinct studies and lose whatever commonality that allows them to be understood together, that allows them to appear coherent. Now, arguably, what has always made any inquiry philosophical is that it has been a cenoscopically semiotic inquiry, an inquiry, that is, into the signs of our own knowledge about some object, which is conducted according to the well-trained use of the common faculty of human intellectual reasoning. Philosophy entails knowing things, to be sure, knowing things other than merely our own knowing. But it also requires a habit of questioning our own knowledge, of seeking the reconciliation of our discoveries, whatever they may be, with the whole of our knowledge, with discerning the complementarity and coherence of the various other things that we have discovered. by a reflective and explicitly semiotic structuring of philosophical inquiry, we discover the continuity between its current specific divisions, between ethics and natural philosophy, between politics and metaphysics, between a philosophy of knowledge and a philosophy of culture, and so on and so forth. Absent such a reflective and explicitly semiotic structuring, philosophy seems often to merely limp along, at best. Now finally, to turn to the problems within communication and journalism studies, I wish to consider the very specific way in which its difficulties have become unveiled by networked digital technology. That is, by the Internet. Now, the early and oft-repeated characterization of the Internet is that it is, or was, an information superhighway. A rather idealistic phrase espousing a belief that the Internet would allow the best presentation of the purest facts to spread the farthest, the fastest. That information being hyper-accessible was a clear benefit to improving the condition of humankind, as it was often thought that highways, and especially superhighways, were a benefit to improving the condition of humankind in the United States, which itself is a rather questionable assumption, but let's stick with the Internet. There was, in this information superhighway, hope that the Internet would usher in an age of universal truth, of universal understanding. The reality, probably all well too known by now, the reality is that the narratives with the greatest apparent gravity are drummed out repeatedly with little regard for whether the facts which they include are true or false, and that, in consequence, there is now likely more angst than ever before over information and disinformation, and likely the least confidence in the truth of any narrative, any story, any apparent fact, any expert, any authority. Are this angst and mistrust merely the effect of bad actors, malicious agents of foreign governments, political ideologues, ideological grifters, malfeasant reporters and journalists serving their own twisted, perverse, and selfish agendas? Well, no doubt, all these sources do contribute to the present miasma of confusion. But even did they not, the flood of information provided by the Internet is simply too much. The overwhelming quantity of information is why narratives, rather than sheer naked facts, tend to dominate mass communication today. For narratives provide channels into which facts may be incorporated, or from which they may be rejected, mitigated or maximized, hidden or emphasized. To be so selective about information allows two or more competing narratives to be factually accurate simultaneously, while presenting nevertheless incompatible or even contradictory accounts of the events in question. These oppositional contradictory accounts began to dominate our public discourse in the late 1990s and early 2000s with the so-called cable news wars. But a fragmentation of narrative has exploded 10,000-fold with the advent of social media, with the Internet of sharing, and the ubiquity of its access. In truth, narratives which select and deselect facts have always been the way of public opinion. But the rapidity of communication in the electronic and now digital ages has exposed the extent of that narrativization. Conspiracy theories inevitably crop up in consequence. No narrative tells us everything. No narrative can tell us everything. And the more that we see certain prevailing narratives are not telling us this or that, the more pressing seems the question which motivates every conspiracy theorist, namely the question of, what aren't they telling us? But the conspiracy theory is no longer just for hardcore disbelievers living at the fringes of society. this has been shown very clearly in recent years, where not only has fake news been able increasingly to disregard facts by sweeping up large numbers in a persuasive narrative, but conversely, even accurate news can be labeled fake for the facts left absent from the presented account or narrative. This variation, this labeling and categorization of one and the same thing in radically opposed ways, shows that it is not merely a matter of the sign vehicle and the object, but also the interpretant. You might see that news story on Facebook and think it exemplifies a case of racial injustice, while your grandfather might think it exhibits a communist plot. And you might both be partly right and partly wrong. The confusion which we see here, in other words, is not a matter of the facts as such, but rather of the pattern of relations through which the facts are presented and on which basis they are understood. For instance, reading the news, one source may describe an alleged perpetrator of a criminal act by his race, his gender, his used weaponry, while another describes him by his age, economic status, and or emotional state. Each may be entirely accurate, but the inclusion of certain details in one account suggests a mitigation of guilt, of fault, while others included in a different narrative indicate an unequivocally malicious intent, or a systematic social problem of which this person is an accelerator or an instrument. Now, depending upon our own presuppositions, our own being as interpretants, we may protest against one set of signs vehicles and accept the other, or we might reject both, or we may recognize as today I believe we must, if we are not to become ideological functionaries ourselves, that the object is irreducible to any narrative in which it is placed. There's always something more than what anyone can tell us. That doesn't mean that we reject what everyone has to tell us, but it means we have to be cautious, careful, and thoughtful in how we interpret any narrative which is given us. So, in conclusion, what are we to make of all of this? Anywhere we look around the world today, we find ourselves confronted with confusions about what things mean. In all our studies, there are countless presuppositions and presumptions, principles taken as axiomatic and unquestioned. Between our studies, there are widening gulfs of unmeaning, filled in by a nominalistic and voluntaristic fabrication of increasingly subjectivized and decreasingly coherent explanations of the world. Someone might infer that the supposed limitations of willpower signify choice as a limited and therefore supremely valuable good. He might develop a neuro-reductive conception of the self, of an identity of one's biological selfhood with naught but the brain. And he may compound this reductive identity by accepting the dualistic conception of nature and culture. And he may turn these elements through which he conceives the being of the human person into a litmus for which news narratives he accepts and which he rejects. There may be truths in his conception and the narratives which he comes to hold, but is there truth? What, if anything, holds it all together? In recent decades, there has been some focus within the university upon the idea of so-called interdisciplinarity. Studies, courses, projects, and publications which attempt to draw upon a multitude of disciplines in order to produce a dynamic and fuller understanding of some complex topic. Heretofore, however, most interdisciplinary efforts have produced not but a facade of such sought-for complementarity. They lack any organic or natural unity in their studies, and therefore do not produce living traditions of knowledge, but only strange mashups that do not quite work. By contrast, to quote John Deely, semiotics, which is nothing but the sign, or rather semiosis, become conscious of itself, that is, the knowledge resulting from study of the action of signs, equally leads into and cuts across the knowledge of objects of every other type. For the action of signs is what the knowledge of objects presupposes and depends upon throughout. Here, interdisciplinarity for the first time and only time is no longer something contrived, but something inherent. As Deely says here, what makes semiotics inherently interdisciplinary is the commonality of signs, the action of which cuts across all objects which we might study. For, indeed, all our pursuits of knowledge, whether in formal academic settings or by browsing Wikipedia, whether sitting in our lecture hall or reading the news, whether found on Facebook or at the Lyceum Institute or scrolling through Twitter, whether a study of life or of the psyche, whether a philosophy or communication or technology, all our pursuits of knowledge are ordered to objects, but are ordered to objects by means of signs. If we wish to understand the object of volition, we need to know what it is and how it is that we are signifying it. If we wish to understand the objects of life and death, this too requires such a semiotic reflection. For it is by such a semiotic reflection that we may distinguish the being of our objects, distinguish into what is true and what is false, and therefore into what is good and what is not. Understand this, Deely states, and you will understand what it is to understand. Thank you for listening.